Hi, I'm Michelle Chen. I'm a postdoc at the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University in New York. And I'm here with my colleague Ian Greer, research professor, and we're going to do sort of a tag team presentation on a project that we did involving ethnographic research on people with criminal records in central New York and their sort of experiences with the economic and social barriers that come with having a criminal record. So just for some background, the main problem that we're looking at is the criminal record as a barrier to employment. So there are all sorts of policy implications as well as just social ramifications for having a criminal record, particularly in the United States. It's not just a barrier to employment, but that is one of the most pronounced social impacts of this. Employers generally conduct criminal background checks. The vast majority, about 70%, I think is one count of employers who use criminal background checks in the hiring process. Although it's generally illegal in New York to deny a job based specifically on one's criminal record, it has to specifically relate to the duties of the job to actually deny someone employment based solely on their criminal record. There is both de jure and de facto discrimination that takes place on a widespread basis. In addition, there are some legal bans on hiring someone with certain convictions on their record in certain sectors. This is typically healthcare, working with children, in some cases, sometimes having, for instance, a financial crime or larceny or something on your record will render you unemployable in a finance position, for instance. So, and in the aggregate, this has a marginal effect on employment outcomes, according to the studies that have been done on it. But it still is significant. So a past criminal conviction of any sort was found to reduce the likelihood of a job offer by 5%. And when you sort of multiply that across the number of people with criminal records across the United States, it's estimated that about 85 million to 104 million, roughly 1 in 3 US adults, have some kind of criminal record. This can include a full-on conviction. It can also include an arrest, right? So simply any kind of involvement with the criminal legal system may land you with a rap sheet that will follow you around for years and years and years. And not surprisingly, there are disproportionate effects of this on Black and brown communities, and African Americans are almost twice as likely as their white counterparts, according to some studies, to face the denial of a job based on a criminal background check. And this is also not even including the fact that often these criminal records are inaccurate or they contain information that may be decades old. So criminal justice reform and the focus on reentry policies and reentry services have attempted to remedy some of these barriers or mitigate some of the barriers. So in New York, there have been both state and city level legislation that makes it easier for individuals to seal their criminal records, meaning that they would not come up in a background check. And this is usually going to involve some sort of bureaucratic procedure, an application process, sort of a petition process before the state. Only 10% of those eligible for such relief are known to access it, according to a 2020 study. So we see that there is pretty low uptake for these services for various reasons. And we're sort of working on the hypothesis that access to better jobs may have beneficial social effects, including a reduction in recidivism and generally stabilization of the communities that are most heavily impacted by incarceration and involvement in the criminal legal system. So the focus of our study was to look at the work transitions of people with criminal records in one particular part of New York, central New York, which is a fairly economically depressed area and one in which people face a variety of barriers when trying to reintegrate into the job market. So precarious work is generally defined as, a risk of job loss, risk of injury, and we're also looking at precarity in people's lives outside of work. So this can include domestic violence, substance use disorder, eviction, health problems, etc. And the main research questions we're trying to tackle is, what difference does it make in someone's individual work life to get relief for their criminal record, so getting their records sealed? How does the sealing of records potentially lead to better employment outcomes, like better jobs? And also, how do other social problems compound or complicate the barriers that are caused by criminal records? Because in many cases, we found that people were facing precarity in their lives before, as well as after the actual thing that landed them with the criminal record. So the focus of our research revolved around a partnership with two organizations. One is called Law New York, Legal Assistance of Western New York, and the Judicial Process Commission. And both of these agencies were involved in different ways with processing individuals' applications for criminal records relief. And we drew from a sample of a few dozen people in Rochester, New York. I think, do you want to describe?
Yeah, so we're researchers at Cornell's ILR school, so the elite higher education institution of upstate New York. And our partners, JPC and Law New York, they asked us to help them evaluate their service. And we did so using interviews because the client population is too small to do quantitative research. And so we were just pulled into this context that we did not know, that was pretty foreign to us. Rochester, New York. So the city of Rochester is about 200,000 people in a metro area with 750,000. There's kind of a slightly crescent-shaped area known as the crescent of poverty, with high levels of poverty, disproportionately not white. Um, and so this is where our partners are based. The vast majority of our interviews were from the city of Rochester. So we did 30 qualitative interviews. Half of them were people 2 years out from using the service, and half of them had just approached the community-based organization. Um, and it was a full range of adult participants. They were mostly black and female. There were some men, there were some white people. Two of the black people were also Hispanic. And they were mostly in healthcare occupations. And this is because they're working with vulnerable populations. They're trying to progress, and criminal background checks trip up a lot of people in healthcare occupations. But there are other low-wage jobs that they were doing. Some of them were getting into these reentry services, serving formerly incarcerated people. The vast majority were doing unpaired care work. That was an important part of their biography. The common charges were larceny, drugs, drunk driving, weapons, but we also had a really important person who was convicted of the murder of her abusive husband. Um, there was forgery, wire fraud. We had a sex offender. So it was pretty heavy stuff, actually. Um, uh, and the forms of relief were sealing, so that makes it less likely that a record will appear in criminal background checks. There's certificates of relief and good conduct, which are also supposed to protect employers from liability when they hire people with criminal records. There are also a lot of mistakes in criminal records that these advocates were correcting. Also, like appeal processes with occupational regulators that were doing the background checks. There's also some suing of employers and representing people in administrative hearings where they're appealing decisions about getting relief. Um, let's see. So so we spent quite a bit of time with the advocates, they do a lot of events to educate the public about what they're doing. And What they say is that if you have a criminal record, this is a big problem in employment, and relief can solve that. So what it does, so sealing certificates, pressuring employers in various ways, means that the employers are not going to discriminate as much. Therefore, people are more likely to get the better jobs that they're trying to move into, and this will lead them to a better life. They will escape poverty, they will stay out of trouble, less recidivism, more good jobs. Um, so this is uh, this takes place in a small number of success stories. We observe quite wide variation in the narratives that people tell of their biographies. So these are biographical interviews. They start with the question, tell us your life story from your first memories to today, and then we ask probing questions about things like what kind of charges did you have? What kind of work have you done? And so if we leave aside people who are, so okay, one reason why it wouldn't help you is you're ineligible for the service. The service can't help because you have an offense, like a sex offense, that makes you ineligible for any kind of relief. Another reason why it might not help you is that you're stuck with a lot of barriers to work, that the service just that overwhelms the effect of the service. So a good example of this was one of our respondents, Maria, who had severe mental health problems. She was also caring for her mother, and she had not had a paid job in a long time, although she spent a lot of her time doing paid care work. Um, Another reason why it might not help you is that your life has already stabilized and you're getting the relief for reasons other than getting a job. And so yeah, there are uh, a lot of people in this space who get jobs in reentry, where having a criminal record is actually a good thing because it means you have lived experience. And so getting your record sealed is actually not helpful. Um, and then we have these two groups that are attached to the labor force and are kind of marginal cases where the service can help, and some that we tentatively call frustrated integration. These are people who are working, and the service removes a barrier to progression, but they still don't switch onto a stable career path. And the barriers that we observe come from their precarious lives, and that includes work and it includes other parts of life. So Jessica, for example, she really wanted to move into healthcare. She worked at a nursing home, and she saw rampant patient abuse, and it was really bad. She did not enjoy it. She was kind of appalled, and she just dropped out of healthcare because of that, and she switched to selling used cars, which she said actually made use of the skills she learned when she was hustling in the street, getting into trouble. So, so she was delightful, but she was not really a success story. Then there are success stories. So this is what the service is trying to do. It removes a barrier to progression in the labor force. You, this allows the person to move into a better job than they had before. When they talk about their life now and their life before, they're less precarious now, and all those elements are present in the story they tell. And there are a few of these, like Bill. He got injured. He had to switch occupations. He was doing something where he was doing manual labor. He needed something that was less physical, so he got a unionized job as a bus driver, and he really needed to get his record sealed in order to get through all the criminal background checks that school districts have to use for bus drivers. Um, so to kind of lay out schematically these two groups who are really uh, who can be helped by this service and how their biographies look. So when you ask the first question, tell us your life story, they start with childhood almost always. And normally there's some kind of trauma. So that's their background. They've been normally abused in some way or multiple ways. Then they enter adulthood, um, and uh, and so their everyday life is shaped by bad, precarious jobs normally, um, sometimes no jobs. Um, and this interacts with other kinds of precarity in their lives. So being poor is a serious problem for progressing, um, getting in trouble, getting arrested, being incarcerated. That's a major risk. One thing that we saw really frequently was just toxic relationships, conflict, and in ways that really frustrated attempts to progress in life and work. Um, so that's kind of the system of everyday life. And then to this one thing acting on it is these reentry services, which is part of a broader support system, job trainings, church, family, friends, etc. These help people progress and overcome their barriers. And on the other hand, they talk about employer discrimination and alongside other structural forces of oppression that they encounter. And they talk explicitly sometimes about race, class, gender, disability, migration status, and the problems that those cause that increase the precarity of their lives or reinforce it. So the output of this is the life that they're living now or their future planned life, which is integration into a stable, good job and a stable life, which is either frustrated, life doesn't change, remains precarious and chaotic, or it's successful. So there's this thing that they talk about, which is turning around their life. And actually, this structure, they are coached to tell their stories with this structure in order to get relief. They have to say, in order to get a certificate or getting ceiling, I need this in order to turn my life around, get a good job, stay out of trouble. Um, so I will pass it to Michelle.
Awkward back and forth. He could have done all the slides, but he let me have a go at the mic. So ultimately, we were trying to look at the effects of the service on workers' biographies. So in our ethnographic research, we tried to get a sense of how criminal records relief was one thing acting on a whole sort of maelstrom of different factors that were inducing precarity in their lives. And we concluded that, at least in the sample that we looked at, the service is not necessarily that effective in helping people secure better work. And we can speculate on why that is. We've already talked about how there are some sort of basic barriers, such as just simply not being eligible for this kind of relief. But we also found that sort of from a holistic standpoint, when you look at the totality of their lives and everything going on in it, we see that both the criminal record and the effects of the service are overdetermined by structural constraints and other features of everyday life that they're dealing with. So this can range from mental health issues to domestic abuse to substance use disorder. We found that everyday life was shaped by this sort of interplay between precarity in their work and precarity outside of work. So we found that while some people do benefit, there is a contrast between sort of frustrated and successful reintegration stories. It's unclear to us now what explains the difference. It's highly contingent on people's individual circumstances, but we will be following up with our subjects in 2026. We'll look at how will the criminal records relief sort of ultimately affect their long-term job stability, employment prospects, et cetera. Will it lead to better jobs? Will it lead to more stable economic circumstances for them? Will it lead to better reintegration? Particularly, will it prevent them from having any further involvement in the criminal legal system? And what are the mechanisms? So in addition to providing this sort of one bureaucratic form of relief, are there social and cultural ties that are anchoring them? Are there psychosocial benefits that come with the sealing of a criminal record that would ultimately also have a broader sort of effect in their lives. We talked about how people have these individual redemption narratives that is important to their own sense of sort of overcoming their past circumstances. And of course, are there material benefits that come out of this relief, for example, higher pay. And we just want to look at sort of other interventions and services that can facilitate economic advancement and whether or not there are policy interventions that can change outcomes for people. In the reentry world, there is now an initiative in New York called the Clean Slate Law that will that will put in place a mechanism for automatic sealing of criminal records. So this would be done presumably without the individual petition process when it works properly, and that's just being rolled out now. And so another thing we want to research is how might the automatic sealing of criminal records ultimately affect these interactions with other structural barriers.